Good afternoon. Welcome to the latest in our series of ENO Center for Transportation webinars. Today we're discussing transportation governance with Marty Wax and Emil Frankel. Marty is a professor emeritus at the University of California, Los Angeles. He was also a professor in civil and environmental engineering and city and regional planning at UC Berkeley, where he also served as director of the Institute for Transportation Studies. He has published prolifically on a wide range of topics in transportation engineering, planning, and policy. Emil is a senior fellow here at the ENO Center for Transportation. He previously served as the Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy at the US DOT, as well as Commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Transportation. Today, Marty and Emil will discuss transportation governance structures, funding arrangements, decision-making mechanisms, and operating practices. The conversation is following a workshop conducted by ENO in conjunction with the Reason Foundation earlier this year, and it involved transportation professionals from various levels of government, private sector, and academic sectors from across the country. We're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end. Please feel free to enter your questions into the question box on the side of your screen at any point in time, and we'll get to as many as possible after the presentation. With that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Marty.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to talk about the results of a workshop that was held at the Pocantico Conference Center near Tarrytown, New York, and 24 people participated. They were scholars in the field of transportation, including me, executives, experts in transportation, including Emil and Alice. And it was convened jointly by the ENO Center for Transportation, which is, of course, the host of this webinar, and also the Reason Foundation, and funded by the Smith-Richardson Foundation as well. And the purpose of it was to explore how dramatic changes that are affecting the transportation system are going to affect governance and institutions. That is, we often talk about changes in technology. We often talk about the growth in traffic congestion, but we are approaching them with institutions that change much more slowly than the conditions that affect transportation in our world. So the goal of the workshop was to begin a discussion that will lead to specific recommendations. And as you might imagine, when you have 24 people around the table for about 2.5 days, much of the discussion was at a high level of generality. It was about principles and ideas, and we hope that you'll appreciate that, but at the same time, we all need to begin to think about specifics that will follow up on these principles. So if I could have the next slide, we addressed as background for coming to some agreements and general principles, we addressed the external and internal forces that are impinging upon the transportation system and affecting governance and institutions. And one of the important things to do to start is to distinguish between what we meant what we meant by external and what we meant by internal, but you can almost guess. External forces are those that impinge upon the transportation system that we, as members of the transportation community, probably can influence only in marginal ways. And internal forces are more about the way we go about doing our business. So external forces included a large number of them. I don't have the time to summarize them all, but they include, for example, the increased concern over global change and the impact on weather and water levels and temperature and so on the transportation system, the development of new vehicle technologies and automated and connected vehicles, and the growing role of Lyft and Uber type services, transportation network services, but also broader political economic trends like the increasing dependence of urban and regional economic development on a high degree of regional accessibility and the growing congestion in many cities, and at the same time, the national decline in transit use, which obviously is connected in some way to the importance of a regional transportation system, the growth of congestion, and how all of those things are going on together at the same time. By internal forces, we meant what's going on within the governance and institutional framework in which we all work. For example, decreasing dependency on federal aid while increasing the number of states that are, while increasing dependence upon state sources, local sources, non-tax sources, the rise of local option sales taxes, election in which the voters approve or disapprove of proposed transportation programs, sometimes that are inconsistent with regional plans. And this is internal to transportation, but a very important force. The failure to develop effective access to private capital, technology, and project development expertise in the private sector on the part of the public sector addressing transportation, and our inability to develop state and regional and local relationships between transportation agencies and those kinds of agencies that do important things that impinge upon transportation, such as those that deal with housing, and those that deal with land use planning, and those that deal with environmental rules and regulations that then have to be complied with by the transportation sector. And the second, the image on this screen, reform versus revolution. We discussed at some length whether we have to sort of blow up all of our existing institutions and start from scratch. And in the end, of course, concluded that that's never happened and not likely to happen, and that change is likely to be gradual, and it's likely to be dependent upon the availability of funds and possibly even changes in federal legislation. So in general, we agreed that reform was the appropriate way to think about the kind of change that's necessary. And then the third sort of background part of the discussion before we got into the recommendations and findings, we looked at what we mean by when we use terms like governance and institutions. And by governance, we mean things like legislation and regulation and policy and decision-making, conventions like using benefit cost analysis, and relationships between the public and private sector, and that sort of thing. Who has jurisdiction over what? But by institutions, we meant the actual organizations, private sector companies, transit agencies, city governments, and so on. I think that the relationship between governance and institutions is obvious, but we wanted to focus separately on what institutions constitute the group of organizations that participate in government. So now let's turn to the next slide. And the first, this slide is going to unfold as a pie chart with talking briefly about each slice of the pie. The first one is that the very great importance of vision. It's widely been said by many people that when the federal government was busy building the interstate system and all the states were partners, we were together on the same page, sharing a vision, a national vision that kept us going for 20 years. And that the sense that we've lost national vision is widely shared. And there's an obvious need in the next federal transportation bill to be clearer about setting out a national vision, and a whole dialogue is needed to discuss that. There was also in the discussion at the workshop a really deep discussion and some substantial disagreements as to what the roles of the private sector and the public sector should be. We're clearly in a period when the role of the private sector is increasing. Many innovations are coming from the private sector. And what should the federal government be doing to both stimulate those, and what should it be doing to regulate the private sector is a very big discussion. And what should be done at the federal level and at the state and local levels. And the next slide slides, I should say, emphasizes that some experts at Pocantico recognized and discussed that there should be a very lasting and important federal role, even though we are all sensing a declining federal role and a devolution of decision making to state and local levels. There wasn't unanimity on what the federal role would be, but for issues like research, development, and the charting of a course that involves such issues as civil rights and equity. Those are national problems, and federal policy should remain central to shaping the institutions of our future transportation system. And the next slide is about sources of funds. Should transportation at the state level, at the local level, and certainly at the federal level be continue to rely on user fees, on things like taxes on gasoline and tolls, and the evolution perhaps of mileage-based user fees? Or should there be a transition back to what was common a very long time ago, many decades ago, and that is funding transportation out of general revenues? There are pluses and minuses associated with each. And when speaking of the sources of funds, we also got into the question of accessing private capital. There's a huge amount of wealth in retirement funds, and there's investment capital available. And while transportation has gone in that direction, it probably hasn't gone far enough in that direction. Next, we compared and discussed metropolitan and rural mobility. The nation's transportation system clearly is focused upon the economic development that is taking place in urban areas, in urban metropolitan areas, really. Most of the growth is concentrated in the largest metropolitan areas, and both investments in connecting them with our air system and possibly high-speed rail, and in the Northeast Corridor, there's a rich rail network. That's important, and inside the metropolitan areas, there's a great deal of investment, but we have to be careful at the same time not to overlook the importance of mobility in rural areas where there are few alternatives to automobile and trucks and rail for freight, and they really have different needs. So at the conference, there was a very clear commitment to being certain that we don't overlook rural needs when focusing on metropolitan needs, which are so great. The next slide, the next slice, I keep saying, is about federal fund allocation. We all pretty quickly agreed that the formulas by which federal funds are distributed to states, even as federal money declines in relation to the total cost of operating a system, are obsolete and should be revisited. And that, for example, to emphasize other things that are not emphasized under current funding, such as state of good repair, and that there might be a whole reorganization of federal funding. Should it be done by formulas? Should it be done by application and distribution of funds in response to well-formulated programs in different states, but not according to formula? We understand these are that would bring about a huge public debate, but that's a debate we want to see happen, actually. It's a discussion that would enrich our field very, very much. And then the last slice is informed decision-making. The complex issues that bear on transportation decision-making merit reconsideration of how decision authority is allocated between transportation professionals and elected officials. There's a need to have better information on the table when choices are made, when funding decisions are made, when projects are accepted for long periods of investment and development. And there are improvements in databases and electronic decision tools, and we are not taking full advantage of those. So the next slide let's move on to uh, key issues for institutions. And after the previous discussion, we discussed the importance of addressing national needs uh, in um, uh, in whatever new institutional changes take place. That is, there is definitely a role for a federal statement of national needs, and there is a need for intercity and national scale projects, whether it's highways of national significance or however it's framed. As we approach the next reauthorization, national needs need to be clarified and expanded, and the discussion needs to be expanded. Next, widely discussed, but still not fully addressed, the use of data and economic analysis to report on and analyze the quality of the performance of our system is definitely needed. And we talked about a number of examples from the Federal Transit Administration and other pilots that have done pretty well at improving performance requirements. They need to be disseminated nationally. The next slice emphasizes interagency collaboration at state and local levels. I think we've sort of already referred to this on the previous slide, that we need to explore and empower new forms of institutional arrangements. So, for example, the I-95 Corridor Coalition, which is not a government, but which is a form of collaboration across many states, was talked about and cited as an example. I'm going to go in just a few more minutes and run a minute or two over, I guess, of my 15 minutes. But the next slice was project delivery and procurement. The federal government could do much more to influence the way projects are expedited and delivered. There are several federal programs, one called Expedited Project Delivery at USDOT, one called Everyday Counts, and the techniques for expediting project delivery are really important because long delays and institutional threats such as lawsuits and environmental reviews that go on interminably raise the cost of projects and delay the delivery of service to the clientele that we're trying to serve. The next slice shows that we need to explore the wide variety of new funding mechanisms that have emerged in the states, and many of those are voter approved. Many of them are partnerships with other agencies than transportation agencies, and that they should be empowered and incorporated for federal funding and support in the next round of reauthorization discussions. The next slice is public-private partnerships. Those have been widely discussed, and the track record so far is actually quite mixed. Some have been enormously successful and resulted, for example, in new rail service in several states that is privately operated. However, in many cases, public-private partnerships have resulted in the bailout of the private by the public, and we need to understand that more. We need to create opportunities for experimentation, and we need to evaluate the results so that they can be more widely applied nationally. And the last slice refers to the resources at state and local governments. They're very uneven. There are some metropolitan planning organizations that have very highly qualified staffs and the capacities. There are some that are tiny and are not up to date even in the computer software that they use. And MPOs, of course, are not the only organizations, but they provide a good illustration. There's a wide variety as well among state departments of transportation in the capacity that they have. And there is concern about workforce development as people retire. And some agencies are finding it quite difficult to find the skills that they need. So that's the last slice of that slide, and let's move on to the final one. With all of this as background, what should we be doing? We as the participants in the workshop, the sponsors of the workshop, obviously we're urging that there is a need for renewed focus on governance and institutions. We think that's an under-addressed subject in the field of transportation. And we don't have the funding to actually launch a big national review and new program. But what ENO is planning to do over the next months and year is to serve as a clearinghouse for institutional reform, to publicize and collect information. And we hope that you, as participants in this call, will contribute to that effort while we proceed with efforts to find funding for additional follow-up activities. So the last one is we want to launch an initiative to address this important subject matter, and over the next weeks and months, we'll be seeking funding from a variety of sources in order to expand this activity that just started. At this point, maybe we should turn to those who are participating to make comments and ask questions. Alice?
Yes, thank you, Marty. That was a really good recap of a lot of what we talked about earlier this year. And yeah, I'm going to start fielding some questions to you. So we have a question here about technology. Marty, can you mute yourself real quick? I think we've got an echo going.
Can I mute myself? It's very quiet here.
All right, excellent. Thank you. And then I'll ask you to unmute once I finish the question. We have a question here about technology and looking at sort of catalysts for change today and thinking about technology as something that a lot of people see as fixing a lot of the problems that we've historically seen in transportation. However, it's possible that this isn't necessarily the one big fix. And how do you see the role of policymakers sort of shifting the conversation in a productive manner towards what the best practices and solutions should be, instead of looking at technology as a tool to fix all current problems in transportation? And you can go ahead and unmute now. Thanks.
I've just muted myself. I hope I can be heard.
Yep.
I think history is a great source of inspiration on that question. Remember that the technologies that we now take as standard and given, like the automobile and public transit, were themselves new technologies, and the role of government that was necessary in order to regulate them and inspire them and sort out what are the technologies that work best and which don't. And I think that technology is very, very important, needs to be regulated, needs to be inspired, but the organizations need, such as metropolitan planning organizations and transit districts and such, need to have a better grasp on what they want to achieve from new technology. They have been operating for a very long time in a responsive mode. So, you know, when scooters appeared, they tried to regulate them, and so far have not been very, very effective. So I think the focus on institutions is really about setting priorities. What do we want these new technologies to actually do in a participatory forum where the technology experts, but also the lay public, can influence the evolution of public policy? Emil may want to add something to that.
No, let's go on to the next question, and
Okay.
We'll bring Emil in on the next question,
Sure.
which asks about different levels of transportation institutions, different levels of government. And so we talked about, local, regional, state, federal level. It seems like there's a lot of discussion, especially around MPOs and states, and how those institutions can be reformed and changed amongst changing demographics and changing travel patterns. Can you talk a little bit about how those institutions specifically can be better supported and what we need to think about at different levels of government?
Let me. This is Emil Frankel. Let me respond, if I may, to that by saying that I think the general view of the participants in the workshop, and certainly those of us here, is that there's no single answer. There's no one shoe fits all sizes. That institutional structures will have to be developed that fit the particular nature of a state or a set of states or region, metropolitan area, and so forth. But the key thing is that state, local, regional stakeholders and officials need to devise structures and organizational structures and decision-making and analytical processes that have sufficient geographic reach, have sufficient reach across modes and elements of society, in order to assure, as Marty said earlier, that projects and programs are appropriately evaluated, prioritized, that there is sufficient geographic reach for these programs and projects to be implemented in a way that really is beneficial in terms of meeting social needs and providing economic benefits. So there's no single pattern. A key thing, I think, is that these are threshold issues, that if these institutions and decision-making and analytical processes don't exist appropriately at the state, local, regional levels, we're going to get bad decisions, and we're not going to make maximum utilization of constrained financial resources.
Completely agree. Anything to add, Marty?
Well, in some metropolitan areas, like the San Francisco Bay Area, they're talking about as much as $1 billion of new investment in infrastructure generated locally, but they are also talking about whether, in order to wisely spend that money, they need to reorganize the way transit service is delivered throughout the region, and maybe some consolidation and reorganization of existing institutions. It's that kind of discussion as to how institutions and governance are organized, as well as the projects and capital expenditures, that I think is very much needed.
Great. All right, we have time for one more question, and it's going to be a hard one that I wasn't going to ask you, but like 3 people have asked, so I'm going to go for it. Can you talk a little bit about the connection between the policy discussion that we've been having and the reality of politics, and sort of what the connection is there and how we can move forward and what that discussion looks like?
Well, I certainly feel that critical decisions about the future of transportation have to be inherently political. But I also feel that we have a responsibility to inform elected officials of what the options are and how they function. So I've heard in my county, Los Angeles County, I've heard county supervisors say things about transportation which I find to be well-meaning, but not based upon facts. So the issue is, how can we link technical analysis and information and data with political judgment? And that's what governance is. We're not aiming to replace governance by technical decision-making by engineers, and we're not aiming to make engineering irrelevant, but governance is the complex joining together of those forces, and it's really challenging, as you said. I agree.
Great. All right, so we're gonna actually do one more question. You said that very succinctly, and I might turn to Emil first on this one. You mentioned sort of what the next steps in general are, but I'm wondering sort of more specifically what can and should we be doing moving forward? Well,
it gives me an opportunity, as Marty would, to emphasize that what we were seeking to do here in this webinar, in the report of the workshop, and the work that we did at Pacantico, is to open up a discussion. These are critical threshold issues that are frankly not appropriately analyzed, addressed, and discussed. Certainly in the discussions that have occurred over now the last 30 years over the surface transportation authorization bills, there is little attention paid to institutional structures, the planning processes, project selection at the state and local and regional levels. So we hope to open up a discussion. Marty touched on this. We hope to be able to utilize the pages of Eno Transportation Weekly to have people do opinion pieces. There's no single answer here. It's a question of precipitating a wide discussion, and we hope to continue to stimulate contributions to that discussion through our own analysis and work and evaluations. But we urge everybody else, including people on this webinar, to think about these issues, to talk about these issues in the context of their own regions and localities, and to make contributions, to do some writing and talking about them and stimulating a broader discussion about them.
Great. So I'm gonna, Marty, anything to add?
No, except to thank everyone for participating and to underline what Emil said. We would love to hear what others think about these issues. So please keep in touch with us and write to us and share your ideas with the Eno group.
Great. And I'm going to ask you to mute yourself again. Thank you so much, Marty, for your time and insights. And yeah, Eno would like to thank everybody for joining us. You can contact us at publicaffairs@enotrans.org to help participate in the discussion or with further questions. You can also go to our website, enotrans.org, where you'll find a recording of the webinar and the slides from today's presentation, as well as a full report, which goes over the issues discussed at the workshop in February in much more detail that may be of interest to all of the listeners. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us, and have a great afternoon.